Hey there, friend. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you're doing all right tonight. My name is Den. This isn't my story. It was shared with me by a man I met in northern Michigan. He was calm, quiet, the kind of man who doesn't talk much. But when he told me what happened to him, I knew I had to share it. The little one. What the forest gave back, some things don't want to be found. Others just want to be remembered. It was in the hush before October's first frost that Caleb Whitmore heard the crying. Not the wind, not an owl. A cry. High, human-like, trembling with a kind of sorrow that doesn't belong in the woods. He was 58 then, long settled in his quiet cabin deep in the northern Michigan pines, where silence was a friend, and solitude a routine. But that day, the forest gave him something else, something it had been holding on to for a very long time. He followed the sound, past the mossy bend where deer tracks usually wandered. What he found kneeling beneath a crooked pine was no child, no animal he recognized, and certainly no ghost. It was something in between. Something looking up at him with eyes too knowing, too human, and too terribly lost. This is not a story about monsters. It's not about proof, or photographs, or any desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. It's about a moment, a meeting, a choice. And how, for one man, the forest whispered not fear, but a quiet plea to be understood. Now, nearly 20 years later, Caleb is ready to tell it. I still remember the exact pitch of that cry, not just because of what it sounded like, but because of how wrong it felt. It was a late October afternoon, cool and dull and quiet in a way only this part of northern Michigan understands. The kind of quiet that presses into your chest, soft at first, then slowly heavier, until your heartbeat feels like the loudest thing in the woods. That was the day I heard it, a child's cry, thin, warbled, distant, like it had been passed through trees and fog in 100 years of waiting. I'd lived near those pines for almost 3 decades, long enough to know their moods. Birds don't sing after frost. Coyotes call around dusk. But this was different. I stood still for a long moment, axe slung over my shoulder, the trail dirt soft beneath my boots. Then I started walking. Slow, measured steps toward the sound. I told myself it was probably a fawn, or maybe a cat. I told myself a lot of things that day. Most of them were wrong. The sound led me past my normal path, past the old windfall, where the ground dips and smells like cold metal and cedar. Then I saw it, just there, hunched against the side of a leaning pine, maybe 10 yards off. At first, I thought it was a large raccoon or some kind of dog. But then it looked up. Its face, my God, its face wasn't right. Not wrong, not grotesque, not monstrous, just close. Close to human. Close enough to freeze me mid-step and close enough that I didn't feel fear. I felt heartbreak. It was small, 3 feet tall, maybe, covered in dark matted fur, streaked with mud and pine needles. Its eyes were too large, too black, wet with tears, and locked onto me the way a child stares at a stranger in a strange place. I didn't speak right away, didn't move. We just looked at each other. Then it whimpered, and I did the only thing I could think of. I reached slowly into my pack, pulled out the sandwich I'd made that morning, and tore it in half. I laid it on a flat stone between us, backing up a few steps like I'd seen folks do with stray dogs. It watched me, nostrils flaring slightly, then inched forward, crawling more than walking. The sound of its limbs on the leaves, soft and unsure, stuck with me. It took the bread, sniffed it, then ate fast, like it hadn't had food in days. Then it looked up at me again. That's when I noticed the limp. Its right leg dragged slightly, the fur matted differently, darker. Maybe blood. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe just instinct, maybe loneliness. But I said softly, "You're hurt." Of course, It didn't answer, but it didn't run either. Something about its gaze. It wasn't wild. It wasn't animal. It was deliberate, like it had been waiting, like it had recognized something in me. I don't remember making the choice to bring it back with me. It wasn't a choice, not really. It followed me as I walked, hesitant, slow, but close, like it had decided, just as quietly, that I wasn't a threat. Back at the cabin, I laid out an old blanket near the hearth. I didn't want to force it inside, but the wind was picking up and it was shivering. It stepped through the doorway like it had never seen walls before. Every movement was careful, eyes scanning everything. It sniffed the rug, touched the wooden chair, glanced at the flickering fire. I said again gently, "You can stay." That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair, pretending to read, though my eyes never left it. It had curled into the blanket. Small. Still trembling, but quiet. The firelight danced on its fur, casting shadows that didn't quite match the shape of its body. I listened to the wind and its slow, rhythmic breathing, and, for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. I should have been scared. God knows anyone else would have been, but I wasn't. Maybe that was the first mistake. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized something else. Every few minutes, it would glance toward the door. Not in fear, in expectation, like it was waiting, like someone else, something else, was meant to come. At one point, it stood, walked, more limped, toward the windows, and stared out into the trees. I watched from the kitchen, half-eaten toast in hand. When it turned, it walked to the small table where I kept a picture of me and my brother from decades ago. Before his accident, before the silence swallowed my world. The creature picked it up, looked at it, then pointed to the woods. It didn't speak, but it didn't have to. That's when I knew it was lost. That whatever it was, wherever it came from, it hadn't just wandered into my life by chance. It had been separated, and it was asking me, without words, without threats, to help it find its way back. But I was hesitant, because some things in the woods, they don't just vanish. They're taken. And sometimes, when you go looking for what the forest keeps, it doesn't always let you come back. The next morning broke with the kind of gray that sticks to your bones. Outside, the woods were heavy with mist. Trees draped in cold silence. There was no birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, not even the wind. Just a thick stillness that made everything feel paused, like the world had taken a long breath and was waiting to exhale. I stood by the window, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the figure curled on the old blanket near the fireplace. It barely moved through the night, though now and then it'd stir, eyes fluttering open for a second, only to return to that state between alertness and exhaustion. I kept telling myself I was just helping something that couldn't help itself. A creature, an injured animal, that's all. But as the light shifted through the window and I saw its eyes open again, wide, dark, aware, I knew I was lying. This wasn't an animal, and it wasn't something I could explain away with the usual comforts of science or instinct. No, this was something else. Something waiting. It didn't take food right away that morning. Just sat there, gaze fixed on the front door. I tried to distract it with soft tones, movements that wouldn't startle. I knelt, hands open. Still, nothing. But then, slowly, it reached again for the picture on the side table, the one of me and my brother from before the fall. It held it longer this time, small fingers brushing against the glass like it was trying to understand what it meant. Then it turned to me, pointed, small hand trembling, toward the woods. That single gesture, silent, sure, and full of ache, told me everything. It wanted to go home. But where was that? And what kind of place did something like that belong? Still, I couldn't ignore it. My gut twisted with that same old ache I'd carried for years. Guilt, maybe. or just the hollowness that comes from too much solitude. So I packed a small bag, water, a knife, my compass, a flashlight, and zipped up my coat. When I opened the door, cold air spilled into the cabin like it had been waiting there all night. I turned, saw it already standing, leaning slightly on its injured leg, but ready. We didn't speak. We just walked. The forest felt different that day. Not threatening, but not friendly either. Like it was watching. I'd walked those paths 1,000 times before, but that morning they seemed unfamiliar. Shifted somehow. The light filtered through the trees in thin, harsh rays, and the silence was thicker than ever. Even the crunch of our footsteps on the frosted ground sounded dampened, like the forest was muffling us on purpose. For the first hour or so, it led me, stopping every so often to sniff the air, to listen, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. Sometimes it would kneel and place its tiny hand on the earth, as if trying to feel vibrations I didn't know existed. Then, just before noon, we reached a clearing. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't mine. They weren't ours. They were larger, much larger. Deep impressions in the half-frozen soil, spaced wide apart, as if whatever made them had a stride twice the size of mine. And there were more, others, smaller, crisscrossing, weaving in and out of the brush. It looked like a group had passed through, a group that didn't want to be found. I felt something tighten in my chest, a mix of wonder and dread. It let out a sound then, a low, soft noise that vibrated more than it echoed. A sound of recognition, of loss. It dropped to its knees near the largest track, fingers trembling as they traced the edges. I knelt beside it, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. I chose silence. It seemed more respectful. After a while, it stood slowly, reluctantly, but it didn't move forward, didn't follow the trail deeper. It just looked up at me, and in its eyes I saw something that floored me. Resignation. That was the first time I realized we might not find them. We returned to the cabin that afternoon. The air had turned colder, the sky bruised with the threat of snow. It didn't eat much that night, didn't curl up by the fire the same way. Instead, it sat by the window, chin resting on its knees, staring out at the trees like it was willing them to change. I stayed up again, watching it. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. There's a line you don't cross with the wild, not because of danger, but because of balance. Because some things aren't meant to be brought inside, no matter how lost or lonely they are. But it was too late. It had seen me. I had seen it, and that mattered more than I understood. But I ignored that feeling. And I shouldn't have. Because sometimes what you think is lost is only hiding from what it fears most. That night, just before sleep, I heard it let out a soft sound, almost a song, a calling maybe. Something wordless, ancient, filled with longing. But nothing answered. And I knew right then the forest was keeping something from us. Something that didn't want to be found. Not yet. The second night came faster, or maybe time just folded in on itself, like it tends to do when you're out there in the quiet. When there's no television, no phone, no ticking clock. Just the fire breathing low, and something not quite human curled up a few feet away from me. I didn't ask it to stay. I didn't tell it could leave either. But it didn't leave. It just stayed, eyes occasionally flicking toward the door as if it was expecting something, or someone to come knocking. That constant expectation, the way it leaned slightly every time a branch creaked or a gust kissed the window pane, started to wear on me. Not because it was annoying, but because it mirrored something I hadn't faced in a long time. What it feels like to wait for something that isn't coming back. I spent most of that evening tending the fire and listening. To it, to the wind, to my own thoughts turning over and over like rocks in a stream. I tried speaking, gently, just to fill the silence. told it my name. Caleb. Told it about the house. How I built it board by board after losing my brother. How I'd lived alone since. Not because I had to, but because people exhaust me more than the wilderness ever could. It didn't respond, of course. But I swore its breathing shifted when I spoke, like it understood more than it should. At some point, I pulled out an old wool blanket and laid it near the fire, giving it a space of its own. Not a cage, not a corner, just something that said, "You're safe." It looked at it, blinked slowly, then moved with a surprising grace, despite the limp, and curled into it. I sat nearby, the creak of my rocking chair matching the rhythm of the flames. Later that night, while I was slicing up an apple, it moved again, closer this time. The firelight caught the angles of its face, and I could see its expression more clearly. Not animalistic, not alien, just tired, as if it had been carrying the weight of the world on its small shoulders, and finally had a place to set it down, even if only for a moment. I offered it a piece of the apple, slowly, no sudden movements. It paused, sniffed the air, then reached out with one small four-fingered hand. It was shaking as it took the fruit. Our fingers brushed. Its skin was warm, warmer than I expected, not cold-blooded. Real. Alive. I didn't eat the slice right away. It held it for a second, turned it over in its hand, and looked up at me. That was the first time I saw it, truly saw it, as a child. Not a thing. Not a curiosity. A child. Later, as the fire died down and sleep crept in, I found myself whispering something I hadn't said in over 20 years. "You're not alone now." It didn't respond, but it didn't need to. The next morning, I woke to find it at the window again. Same posture. Same quiet watching. But this time, it was holding the photo. My brother and I, decades younger, frozen in some summer long gone. It wasn't just remembering. It was asking. And so I decided we'd try again. This time, I packed better. I made sure we had food, a proper compass, a map, a flashlight with fresh batteries. If it was going to lead me deeper into the woods, I wasn't going unprepared. We left just after dawn, the mist still clinging to the ground like breath. It didn't walk like it had the day before. There was more urgency now, less hesitation. Its steps were uneven but purposeful. It knew where it was going, or at least it thought it did. Hours passed. The terrain changed. The light grew stranger, thinner. And then, somewhere around midday, it stopped. Before us stood an old pine, taller than the rest, its bark etched with strange markings. Not scratches, not claw marks. Symbols, carvings. Old, precise. I knelt, ran my fingers across them, felt a chill trace up my arm. "They speak?" I asked. It looked at me, then back at the marks. Its hand hovered over one, then dropped to its side. Silence again. Then, in the clearing, a rustle. Not a deer, not a bird, something heavier. We both froze. I reached slowly for the knife at my side. Not to use it, just to feel its weight. A comfort, a lie. And then I saw it, a figure, tall, massive, moving between trees, 7 feet, maybe 8, covered in thick brown fur, shoulders like a bear, but upright, too upright. It didn't charge, didn't growl, just stood, half-shadowed, watching. Then another, and another. 3 in total. None of them made a sound, but the creature beside me, my small companion, let out a cry. High, warbled, recognizable. A call, a name. And then it ran. I didn't stop it. What happened next felt like a dream unraveling. The largest of the figures stepped forward and knelt, opened its arms. The child, Because that's what it was. A child leapt into them. The others closed in around them, murmuring sounds I couldn't place, but which felt old, familiar. Familial. They inspected it gently. Another wiped its face. And then the largest one looked at me. Not with hatred. Not with fear. Just a nod. A slow, deliberate nod. I nodded back. I don't know what passed between us in that moment. Understanding? Gratitude? A truce? Then, as quietly as they'd come, they turned and disappeared into the trees. It didn't look back. Not then. But I did. For a long time. And for the first time in my life, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet. A release. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something else. At the base of the carved tree, beneath the symbols, sat a stone. Smooth. Polished. Placed there like a gift. Or a message. I picked it up. Held it in my palm. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't been the only one searching. The cabin didn't feel the same after that. Not colder. Not darker. Just different. The air held a stillness that wasn't quite peace, more like a hush after something sacred has passed through. Little one, as I'd started calling him in my mind, had returned with me. But his gaze never stopped reaching back toward those woods. Every moment since we'd left that clearing, his body had been here. But his heart was still out there, lost somewhere in that tangle of trees and silence. He didn't eat much that evening. I warmed up soup and laid out some bread. But he just sat on the wooden floor near the window, his arms wrapped around his legs, eyes fixed on the edge of the forest beyond the glass. I thought about what I'd seen that day, the way the tall creatures had moved, the way they'd looked at me, not like prey, not like threat, more like an equal. A stranger who'd done something kind, or perhaps foolish. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling back to the moment when he ran from me. Not out of fear, but towards something he thought was home. And then the way he'd turned back with eyes full of confusion, then disappointment. We had found them, hadn't we? So why had he returned with me? That question stayed with me until morning. The sun rose in a slow crawl, pale and distant. I found him again at the same window, same position. But this time, there was something new in his expression. Urgency. His eyes darted more, his body tense, as if something in the forest was calling, just out of reach. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Only the pines, tall and quiet, wearing frost like a warning. Then something happened. He stood up, not slowly or hesitantly like before, but with purpose, limping still, but faster now. He moved to the table where I'd left a few items from our last trip. The compass, the flashlight, a half-folded map. He pointed to them, then the window, then me. There was no misreading this time. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was ready to go back. I nodded slowly, began to pack again. This time, I added more supplies, extra batteries, food, matches, a hunting knife I hadn't touched in years. Not because I planned to use it, but because the woods, even familiar ones, have a way of shifting when you aren't welcome. We left just after midday. I chose a different path, not the one from before, not the trail. This time I followed him. He moved with more confidence than I expected, still limping, but less like he was injured, and more like the limp was simply part of him now. Something accepted. The forest thickened quickly. We passed through stands of birch and pine, where light barely touched the forest floor. At one point, we stopped by a small stream, its surface frozen in a thin, crackling sheet. He crouched there, dipping his fingers into the water, then placed his palm on the earth beside it, as if listening through the soil. That's when I saw the second set of markings, carved deep into the bark of a thick cedar, almost identical to the ones we'd found earlier, but fresher, more distinct. And this time there were more of them, symbols layered atop one another, intersecting lines and curves that didn't belong to any alphabet I'd have ever seen. They weren't decorative. They were directional, or warning. I reached out, touched one of the grooves. Cold, deep, still moist at the edges, like it had been etched that very morning. That's when the wind shifted. It was subtle, just a change in the direction. But the air felt heavier, the kind of shift you feel in your gut more than your skin, like being watched, and not just from one angle, from every angle. He noticed it too. His ears twitched, body tensing, eyes scanning the treetops. Then he grabbed my hand, not hard but firm, and pulled. We moved quickly. The terrain grew more uneven, roots jutting up like bones from the frozen ground. Shadows deepened. My breath began to cloud heavier with each step. He led us to a clearing, a narrow one, where the light filtered in just enough to make everything seem dimly gold and gray. That's when I heard it. Not a growl, not a cry, a voice, but not human, something low, resonant, like a moan pulled from the belly of the earth. My skin prickled. He froze. His hand tightened around mine, then let go. He stepped forward. Another sound. This one closer. And then the trees parted. I can't describe exactly what I saw. Not because I don't remember, but because memory can only carry so much weight before it buckles. 3 figures again. But these weren't the same as before. They were taller, broader. One of them bore scars, ridges that ran across its chest like melted wax hardened in the wrong shape. They were older, wiser, and stricter. Their eyes didn't hold kindness. They held judgment. He hesitated, and for the first time I saw fear in him, not of them but of rejection. Then he did something I'll never forget. He turned to me, placed his small hand over his heart, and stepped forward. One of the larger beings moved, not aggressively, but fast. It sniffed the air around him, examined his injury, then turned to me. Its nostrils flared, its gaze locked onto mine with something I can only call accusation. And that's when I realized they thought I'd taken him, not helped him. Taken. The smallest of the 3 raised its hand. The others paused. The air went still. And then my little one, stepped between them, lifted his hands, made a motion I couldn't decode, and the smallest nodded. A decision had been made, not forgiven, but allowed. They gathered around him again, this time slower, not tender, but respectful. And then, as they turned, he looked back, eyes full of something I hadn't seen before. Sorrow, but not for him, for me. I thought that was the end. But I was wrong, because just as the last of them disappeared into the trees, a sound echoed behind me. A crack. Then a breath. Then another set of footsteps. Not his, not theirs. Something else, coming closer. At first I thought the footsteps were echoes. The forest can play tricks like that. Bounce a sound off bark, or let a falling branch mimic something heavier. But then came the rhythm. A cadence. Not random. Not wildlife. Something, or someone, was walking. Slow. Intentional. I spun around, pulse hammering in my ears, eyes searching the shifting gloom between trees. The frost on the ground hadn't melted from the midday sun, and each breath I exhaled came out white and sharp. Nothing moved. Nothing cold. Just that sound. One footstep. I stood there for a long time, afraid to speak, afraid to move. It wasn't fear of being attacked. It was the deeper, older fear, the sense that something had seen you, judged you, and chosen not to announce itself, something that doesn't need to. But when nothing emerged, I slowly backed away from the clearing, stepping carefully, retracing the route back toward the cedar with the markings. No sign of them now, neither the creatures nor the child. Just me. And that frost-covered forest. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I made camp a few miles out, beside a patch of stone where the earth was too hard for tracks. I lit a fire but kept it low, covered it with a pot to muffle the glow. Sleep came in broken pieces. I kept waking. Sure, I'd heard movement, whispers, or breath not my own. Once, I sat bolt upright, hand on the knife, convinced something had leaned over me. But when dawn came, nothing had changed, except the ground. The frost was marked, dozens of prints, barefoot, not boots, large. Some deep, others feather light like a dancer's step. They circled the camp, never touching the fire, never getting close enough to awake me, but close enough to watch. I followed the prints, south at first, then west, deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't stepped into in years. The trees here grew closer together, their branches netted like fingers. Light struggled to reach the ground. The silence had weight. Hours passed. The tracks became harder to follow, less clear, more scattered. Then, just before the slope of a ridge, I found something else. A tuft of fur, dark, coarse, unmistakable. And just past that, on a moss-covered log, a smudge, a handprint. Small, familiar. He'd been here. But then something else caught my eye. Carved into a nearby birch, a new set of symbols. Fresher, sharper, different from the others. These weren't markers. They were warning. I reached out to trace one, and as my fingers brushed the bark, the sound hit me. A long, low moan. Not from an animal. Not wind. Something old. Something inside the trees. I turned too quickly, slipped on the frost, went down hard, elbow cracking against root. But I didn't stay down long. I ran. I ran the way you run when instinct overrides logic, when your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. When I finally stopped, gasping, legs aching, I realized I was somewhere I didn't recognize. That's when I saw the first one. Not a creature this time, a structure. Half buried beneath vines and rot, built from stone and timber, long abandoned. It had no door, just an opening, dark and too narrow for comfort. And inside I saw bones, not arranged, not scattered. Piled, then movement. A flicker, a flash of dark eyes in the shadows. I backed away, heart thundering. But before I could turn, a voice, clearer this time, cut through the silence. Not words, but something like them, rhythmic, repeating. It wasn't calling me. It was calling someone else. That's when I realized something that chilled me deeper than any frost. They hadn't just been looking for the child. They'd been tracking me, testing me, marking me. And whatever came next wasn't about reunion. It was about judgment. I made it back to the ridge by nightfall, fingers numb, vision blurring at the edges. I found my bearings just enough to return to camp, but my pack had been moved. Not stolen, just shifted. My compass turned sideways. My map folded differently, my food untouched. But my flashlight, dead. Batteries drained without ever being turned on. And sitting on the rock by the cold fire pit, the smooth stone. The same one I'd picked up near the old cedar, but now, carved into its underside, a symbol. One I hadn't seen before. One that matched the last mark on the birch. And it hit me. They hadn't just been watching. They'd been preparing for something bigger, or worse, waiting for me to make a mistake. I sat down hard, stone in hand, frost biting through my pants, and I whispered to the trees, "What do you want from me?" The wind didn't answer. But behind me, in the distance, something breathed. Close, deep, and patient. And I finally understood. This wasn't about helping little one anymore. It was about whether I still belonged. It wasn't until 3 days later that I went back. Not because I'd regained courage, not because I had answers, but because the silence had changed. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. The woods no longer whispered. They waited. Each sound outside, each brush of wind against the siding, felt less like nature and more like breath held in a room you couldn't see. The stone with the carved symbol sat on my table, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the sense that something in it watched me. I told myself I was only returning to place the stone back where I found it. A gesture of respect, but even as I packed my gear, knife, flashlight, compass, 2 days of rations, I knew that was a lie. I wasn't returning something. I was seeking something. The forest didn't greet me that day. It received me. I hiked in through a different path, cutting along the eastern ridge where the birches grow thin and the ravens nest high. I carried the stone in my coat pocket, its weight a steady reminder. I walked until the trail vanished beneath thick underbrush and animal paths, until I was no longer sure if I was being led or doing the leading. That's when I saw the trees, not just a stand of them, but a wall, wide, ancient, leaning together in such a way that the canopy blocked the sun completely. There was a scent here. Not rot, not moss. Something older. Something dry and cold and metallic. And then the carvings began again. This time, not just on trunks, on stones, on fallen logs, on the forest floor, pressed into the frost. Repeated, interwoven. A language, a system, not random. The forest was speaking, not to me, but around, like I'd walked into the middle of a conversation I wasn't invited to, but couldn't escape. I kept walking, kept listening, and then I reached the circle. It wasn't perfect, more a natural depression lined with stones that had been placed, not fallen. In the center, 3 logs laid in a triangle, each scorched at the end like remnants of old fires. I knelt, brushing frost from one, and found more symbols, burned in, not carved. And then I heard the sound, not footsteps, not growls, voice, one, low, speaking syllables that didn't belong to any language I knew, but that felt like they belonged. I turned and saw him. Not the child, not the elders, but something else. He stood taller than me, 8 feet at least, lankier than the others, his fur thinner, grayer, the skin beneath it mottled and dark. But it was his eyes that held me, pale, clouded, not blind, but ancient. He didn't move, just stood there, arms at his sides, mouth slowly opening, releasing those words again. A chant, a recitation. And then another figure emerged. This one, smaller, hunched, limping, little one. But something was different. He didn't run to me. He didn't smile. He looked tired, older, like time had passed differently for him. He stepped forward, stopped between me and the elder, then raised one hand. His voice was softer, quieter, but it echoed with the same rhythm. He was answering. I stood frozen, not knowing if I was interrupting a ritual or watching a warning. Then the elder pointed, not at me, at the stone in my pocket. I hesitated, heart pounding, then slowly pulled it out. His voice stopped. The forest went still. Even the wind seemed to die. Then came the movement. Behind me. Fast, sudden. I turned just in time to see the trees split apart. Not break, not fall, but open, as if bending back to allow something through. What came out was not like them. Smaller than the elder, larger than little one. Its skin was not covered in fur, but stone. No, not stone. Bark, petrified. Twisting, alive. Its eyes were hollow. It didn't walk. It glided, and it passed between us, never looking at me, never acknowledging me. It stopped at the center of the circle, placed one hand on the scorched wood, and the carvings flared to life. Not light. Heat. It didn't glow. It burned. A soft, pulsing ember red like coals deep in the pit. And in that moment I realized they weren't just a tribe. They weren't just a family. They were a people with rituals, with memory, with power. And I had stepped into a sacred place. Not as guest. Not as threat. Not as question. The elder looked at me again. And little one spoke. But this time, I understood. Not words. Emotion. Regret. He stepped closer, placed something in my hand. Not a stone. Not a relic. A tooth. Small. Sharp. Then he said one sound I'll never forget. Caleb. My name. Whispered. Like a farewell. And with that, the circle began to dim. The air cooled. The wind returned. And they faded back, one by one, into the trees. I stood alone again, with a tooth in my palm, and the carvings still warm beneath my feet. I didn't know what any of it meant. Not fully. But I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. That name wasn't taught to him. He remembered it. I didn't go back to the cabin right away. After that moment, after little one said my name with a voice that had no business knowing it, I stayed rooted to the circle like the earth itself was holding me there. The tooth was still warm in my palm, and for a moment, I thought I could feel it pulse, faintly, like something remembered pain, or memory, or both. The air had changed again, not ominous, not exactly, but thinner, sharper, like everything had just shifted. The woods felt alive in a way they hadn't before. But it wasn't the kind of aliveness that made you feel part of something. It was the kind that makes you feel very, very small. I hiked out under a sky smeared with ash-blue clouds, the light falling too fast. The trail seemed unfamiliar, though I was retracing my own steps. Trees that had once stood silent now felt poised, listening. I stopped twice. Once when I swore I heard a whisper in the wind, and once when I realized I wasn't alone. There, just off the path, stood a shape. Still, watching. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just waited, as if it were the one deciding whether I'd earned the right to leave. I stood my ground, looked straight at it, said nothing, and then it nodded. Not a twitch, not a nervous tilt, a full, deliberate human nod. And I understood. Not approval, not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. I returned to the cabin in darkness. The door creaked open like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust hadn't settled, but everything felt older, like time had passed differently out there. Or maybe here. I placed the tooth on the mantel beside the stone, both now relics of a world I didn't know I was stepping into when I first followed that cry in the woods. For days after, I didn't sleep well. I'd hear things. Soft steps outside, wood groaning under weight that never entered. Once, the scent of pine and smoke filled the room with no fire burning. I stopped questioning it, because I knew they weren't gone. They never had been. Weeks passed, then months. Snow came early that year. I didn't leave offerings, not anymore. Not like before, not because I was afraid, but because it wasn't about that now. Whatever connection I had made, whatever bridge had been built, it wasn't based on superstition. It was something else. Something that watched, waited, and only stepped into the light when it chose. I kept the cabin warm, lived as I had before, but now there were moments, quiet ones, when I'd feel it again. That old pressure in the chest, like being observed by something that didn't blink. And sometimes, I'd find things moved. A chair angled toward the window. A dried leaf laid carefully on the table. And once, in the middle of the night, A sound like a whisper in the rafters. Caleb. Soft, barely audible. But real. I didn't get up. Didn't reach for a weapon. I just whispered back. I know. There was a long silence. And then, nothing. But the next morning, something had changed. The photo on the mantel, the one of my brother and me, had been turned, facing out the window, toward the woods. I took it as a message, or maybe just a reminder, that I wasn't the only one who remembered. A few days later, I walked the trail again. Not far, not to the circle, but just enough to feel the cold beneath my boots and hear the branches above. I didn't bring the compass. I didn't bring the knife, just an apple. I laid it on a stone by the bend, and I waited. Hours passed. Nothing came. But when I returned the next day, the apple was gone, and in its place, carved faintly into the rock, a new mark. Not one of theirs. One of mine. My initials. Chiabiu. Carved by something with hands strong enough to etch stone, but precise enough to do it with respect. I didn't cry. Not then. But I felt something loosen inside. A knot I hadn't known was still there. And for the first time in years, I said it aloud. Thank you. The trees didn't answer, but I didn't need them to, because the nod had already been given. And now I understood what it meant. Winter pressed in hard that year, earlier than usual. The first real snowfall came just days after the mark appeared on the stone, and with it came a silence even deeper than before. Not the hush of snow. No, this was different. It was the silence of something fulfilled. Or perhaps something waiting for the next move. I kept the fire burning nearly around the clock. The wind clawed at the windows, but I didn't mind. I welcomed the isolation now. The solitude felt earned. I hadn't seen little one again. Not since the circle, not since the name. But he hadn't left either. You don't forget a presence like that. You don't misplace it. Some part of him stayed behind. Not as a ghost, not as a spirit, but as something more grounded, more chosen. I began to feel it most in the mornings, right before light cracked the horizon. Those few minutes when time doesn't move and the world forgets itself. In that breathless sliver of dawn, I would hear something like movement. Not footsteps, just the idea of movement. Then one morning, I found the apples. I hadn't left them. Not this time. 3 of them, placed gently on the same stone I'd used weeks before. Perfect. No bites, no bruises. Red and shining like they'd been plucked that morning from a tree that shouldn't be bearing fruit in this dead frost. Beside them, another stone. Smooth. Oval. Slightly worn, as if it had been held. This one didn't have symbols. No markings. Just weight. Like it belonged to someone, and now it belonged to me. I took the apples inside, set them on the counter, left one on the table for the next day. It vanished before nightfall. No noise, no tracks in the snow. Just gone. And that's when the dreams began. Soft at first. Flickers. A whisper of moss. A face in shadows. Then deeper. Memories that weren't mine. Running through a forest at night, hand in hand with something larger. Warm breath beside you in the dark. Watching a fire that didn't burn wood but sang. I would wake up with tears on my cheeks. Not sadness. Something else. Something like home. I wrote nothing down. I didn't need to. The memories weren't fading. They were nesting. One night, I left a folded cloth beside the door. An old scarf my brother used to wear before he died. It smelled faintly of cedar and age and smoke. I didn't say why I left it. I didn't have to. I just wanted to give something back. It was gone by morning, in its place. A feather. Long, silver gray. Coarser than any bird I knew. A single drop of something like resin at its base. I kept it. Not because it meant something. Because it felt like it would. And then one evening, A knock. Not loud. Not even strong. Just one tap. Like a finger. Or a thought. I opened the door. Nothing there. But there was something in the air. A scent. Pine. Smoke. And something like dried apples. And across the threshold, in the snow, a pattern. Not footprints. Not symbols. A shape. A spiral. Small. Like it had been traced by a finger. Deliberate. It didn't lead anywhere. It was just there. I stared at it for a long time, then stepped over it, closed the door behind me, and sat in silence. At night I dreamed of a circle of stones, and a small hand reaching up to place something on my chest. A stone. Warm. Beating. When I woke up, I checked the mantel. The tooth was gone. No sign of entry. No open windows. No tracks. Just gone. I should have panicked. Instead, I smiled. Because I knew it had been accepted, returned. A cycle completed. But before I could get up, I saw something new on the mantel. Leaned gently against the old photo of my brother and me, a carved figure. Small. Crude. Made of bark and twine and dried grass. But unmistakable. It was me. Eyes closed. Hands open. As if listening. Or remembering. I didn't touch it. I just left it there. I whispered, "You're welcome." The air stirred. No wind. Just a pressure shift. Like someone stepping out of a room. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not really. Because when you give something without asking, sometimes the forest gives you something back. Not a monster. Not a mystery. A memory. And sometimes that's more than enough. It's been years now, and still, I don't go out there much anymore. Not deep, anyway. I keep to the old paths close to the cabin. Just far enough to stretch my legs and let the trees remind me they're still standing. Sometimes I think they're quieter now. Not empty. Not dead, just content. Like something that was once unsettled has finally folded itself back into the ground. I don't talk about it with many people. A couple over the years, one or two who came through town asking questions about the forest, about legends. They always wear the same look. Half skepticism, half hope. They want the thrill. The proof. They want a story with an ending that explains everything. I never give them that. What I give them is the same thing I'm giving you now. A recollection. An account. A glimpse into a corner of the world where things don't follow rules, and truth is as soft and shifting as fog on the water. One spring, a young man came up the trail. He said he'd heard rumors, whispers from hunters and hikers who said strange things live beyond the third ridge, past where the map trails fade. He asked if I believed in Bigfoot. I told him belief wasn't the point. "Do you think it's real?" he pressed. I took a long look at him, full of drive, full of the kind of certainty that only youth can carry. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I led him to the porch and poured us coffee. He was still waiting for a yes or no, but I gave him what I could. "There are things out there," I said. "Some you see, some you feel. But the real ones, the real ones, the real ones, you help and they remember. They don't need to scare you. They don't want to be seen. They just want peace. The same as any of us." He asked if I'd ever seen one. I said I had. He asked if I had proof. I said I didn't need any. And then I told him about Little One. Not the whole thing, just the parts that mattered. About how sometimes what looks like a creature is just a child trying to find their way home. About how sometimes the scariest thing in the world isn't what's lurking in the woods. It's what's watching you, waiting to see if you'll choose kindness over fear. He didn't know what to say after that. Just sat there quiet, coffee cooling between his hands. A few days later, he left a polished stone on my porch. Didn't knock. Didn't ask for more. Just left it there. I kept it. Of course I did. Because we don't always get closure. Sometimes we just get a chance to do something good, and that has to be enough. But there's something I haven't told anyone. Not until now. Last fall, after the first snow, I was out near the ridge, gathering kindling. The woods were quiet, frost hanging off the branches like glass. I wasn't expecting anything, just walking. That's when I saw it. A shape, small, moving between the trees, low to the ground, swift. I stopped cold. It paused too. We both froze there, in that stretch of space where time turns liquid, and you feel like a child again, watching the impossible take shape. Then, it turned. Not all the way, just enough. And I saw the eyes. Big, black, soft. And I knew. It wasn't him. Not exactly. But it was one of them. He stared at me. I stared back. I didn't move. I didn't speak. But I thought something. So hard, so loud in my mind. I almost whispered it aloud. "Welcome back." And then he was gone. No sound. No sound. No snow disturbed. Just gone. But I didn't feel alone. Not that day. Not since. Because the forest keeps things. Not just bones or secrets or echoes. It keeps moments. It keeps choices. It keeps witnesses. And I've come to believe it doesn't forget those who walk with reverence. Not because we're special, but because we listened. And in the end, that may be the only thing the forest ever asked of us. To listen, to remember, and to let it keep what it must, even if that includes us. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried, quietly like smooth stones in a pocket. You don't take them out to prove a point or to convince the world they're true. You carry them because they changed you. Because they left something behind that never quite leaves. There's a kind of silence that only exists in certain places. Deep woods, abandoned paths, the space between heartbeat and breath when you realize you're not alone, but not necessarily afraid. That silence isn't empty. It's full of questions, ancient ones that don't need answers, only attention. We like to think we know the world, that with enough cameras, enough science, enough noise, we can pin down every shadow, label every echo, and put the wild to rest. But some things resist that. Some things hide not because they're dangerous, but because they know better than to be found. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the unknown is something to conquer, but something to respect. Maybe the most important truths aren't the ones we can prove, but the ones we can feel when everything else goes quiet. When the map ends, and you have to decide whether to turn back or step forward, trusting what you feel more than what you see. There are still places in this world that hold on to their mystery, still ridges and ravines where the old rules apply, where the trees remember and the ground doesn't forget. And in those places, sometimes something watches. Not to scare you, not to hurt you, but to see what you'll do. Because at the edge of the known and the unknown, there's a choice. You can walk away unchanged, or you can listen, really listen. And if you're lucky, if you're quiet enough, you might just hear something speak back. Not in words, but in wind, in leaves, in the rhythm of something ancient breathing beneath the soil. Thank you for listening to this story, not just with your ears, but with that part of you that still wonders, still remembers how it felt to believe in things too strange for daylight. If it stirred something in you, let us know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, your theories, or your own stories in the space below. And if you'd like to hear more tales from the edge of truth and legend, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow along. We're just getting started. There are more woods to walk through, more voices to hear, and maybe, just maybe, one day, something will whisper back.